Hello. I'm trying to see if I don't know why it's not picking up my. Hey, now you can see me. Whoa. So apparently it's just really dark in here. Weird. Um, hmm. Bear with me. Need some spotlights in here. So I'm live. I don't know if anyone's coming in. I'm a few minutes late. That's fine. I don't know why this is so dark right now. I don't know. My computer's being silly. So we are going to start right now looking at some government stuff for the regions, or I'm sorry, the U.S. regions midterm as well as the HOA midterm. So a few of you had asked me to look at the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. So Articles of Confederation is this critical time period where the nation, the United States of America, are now independent from Great Britain. We have to figure out what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, how are we going to set up our nation. And so the first constitution that's created is actually the Articles of Confederation. And this is going to basically be a loose group of independent states. Each state basically acts independently. The Articles itself is pretty weak. The colonists who developed the Articles of Federation, now Americans, are concerned that another tyrant might take over. So they essentially make a very weak national government, giving most of the rights to the people, people being the states. So the federal government really has no power. There's no national currency. There's no regulation of trade between the states. There's no power to tax. If you want to approve a law, you need 9 out of 13 states to agree. There's no national court. Congress actually has to answer to the states. If they want money, they have to ask from the states. And so really the government's completely ineffective. They were able to negotiate the Treaty of Paris under this new government created by the Articles of Confederation. It also passed the Land Ordinance of 1785, which set rules for new states joining the Confederation, and passed the Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. But really, there's no power there for the federal government. State powers were supreme. States could coin money, which meant, if you wanted to travel from New York to Connecticut or New York to New Jersey, you need to exchange money. The states could levy taxes, so they could collect tax money. They could make and enforce laws. But as far as the federal government, they had little to no power. And we see that this is going to be really ineffective. They're really not going to be able to do anything. And so it's with this that it's decided there needs to be a constitutional convention. And it's determined that instead of amending the Articles of Confederation, it has to be completely rewritten, a new constitution created. And what really kind of showed them this was that Shays' Rebellion took place. It was a bunch of farmers, and the federal government couldn't do anything about it. So enter the Constitutional Convention. And what we see is that the new government created under the Articles of Confederation is going to reach back and once again pull from our colonial experiences to develop a new nation under this Constitution. So you have the beginnings of democracy, such as the Mayflower Compact, the Virginia House of Burgesses, New England Town Hall meetings. All of these are examples of early democracy in colonial America, and they're going to once again influence the development of our democracy. So at the Constitutional Convention, there's a series of compromises. The biggest one, the greatest one, the Great Compromise. And essentially what we see is that big states and large states are arguing over how representation in Congress is going to be developed under this new Constitution. And what's ultimately decided becomes known as the Great Compromise. This is a bicameral legislature. So we have two houses, the Senate, which will be two per state, so it's equal, which is going to make small states happy. And then the House of Representatives, which is based on population, which will, of course, make the larger states happy. Other compromise is the three-fifths compromise. So each slave will be counted as three-fifths of a person for representation and taxation. So that was the compromise. So Southern landowners would have to pay taxes. They were also able to count their slaves as part of the representation, thereby giving them more representation in Congress. The Constitutional Convention, they also developed the Electoral College to elect the president to ensure that there wouldn't be some kind of corruption or some kind of issue where you have the common man voting for the president and perhaps elect someone who's not qualified because they've kind of been misled. You have many people in America during that time who are uneducated, so it would make sense that you want some kind of protections. We also see that there'll be a development to allow for more flexibility and change over time, because as they're writing the Constitution, they realize that times would change and needs would change. So they allow for an easier amendment process than was found under the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, when it comes time to ratify the Constitution, it's going to be problematic. There's going to be issues. Some states are going to hold out and not want to ratify or pass this Constitution. So what we see is there's now a debate between the Federalists, who believe in a strong federal government, and the Anti-Federalists, who wanted a weaker national government and really supported states' rights. So the Federalists are pro-Constitution. They write the Federalist Papers. So these are people like Hamilton and Madison who are really going to push for passing the Constitution just the way it is. And then you have the Anti-Federalists who are concerned about the rights of the people and the rights of the states. And so they're going to push for a Bill of Rights. Like, we want it spelled out in the Constitution that we have these rights and we are protected. Federalists argue, hey, we don't need that. If the power isn't in the Constitution, then it can't be done, so don't worry about it. And the Anti-Federalists like, I'll feel a lot better if we spell this out. And then so the first 10 amendments become known as the Bill of Rights. But that was the major debate as far as ratification goes. And eventually we'll have enough states pass the ratification of the Constitution and it'll take action. All right, dogs are moving. So if we look at the Constitution, it really kind of outlines the powers of our federal government, and it talks about the three different branches. So you have the legislative branch, which is Congress. So you have the Senate, which is two per state, and then the House of Representatives, which is based on population. They have the power to make laws. They can override vetoes. They can approve appointments to the Supreme Court by the president and treaties negotiated by the president. That's an example of the checks and balances. They're the ones who will create, the budgets and the tax bills. They regulate interstate trade or trade between the states. They have the power to declare war. If there's an impeachment trial to try to remove a president from office, what we see is that impeachment comes through Congress. Then you have the executive branch, which is the president, the vice president, their cabinet, and they are in charge of enforcing laws. They can veto laws passed by Congress, which is a check and balance. They can appoint ambassadors, diplomats, judges, cabinet members. They can make treaties. They can grant pardons. And they have a number of jobs, such as commander-in-chief, the head of the state, chief diplomat. And initially, George Washington will be our first president who really sets this precedent that there's only 2 terms. After 2 terms, that's it, you're done. But eventually this will be changed by the 22nd Amendment, and now legally a president can only have 2 terms. The third branch would be the judicial branch. So this would be the Supreme Court. They interpret the laws. They have the power of judicial review thanks to the Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison. So this allows the Supreme Court to review laws and determine if they are unconstitutional. They can settle disputes between states, states and the federal governments, states and foreign countries, individuals and federal governments as well. And so all three of these branches have different powers to essentially ensure one branch won't become more powerful than others. So these are checks and balances. And I've mentioned a few of those beforehand. Another important aspect of the Constitution would be flexibility. We need to be able to adapt. So you have the elastic clause, also called the implied powers or necessary and proper clause. So this is the power of Congress to be able to create laws deemed necessary and proper to carry out their powers. We're also able to add amendments. So we've had 27 amendments that have allowed the Constitution to adapt and change. And then, of course, judicial interpretation. So judicial review, Supreme Court can look at a case or an action and be like, this is unconstitutional, we can't do this. One of the important topics that comes up is this idea of federalism. So that's that separation between states and federal governments. So the federal government and the state governments. So there's various powers. So you have delegated powers given just to Congress, concurrent powers. These are powers shared with state and federal government. So this is like the power to tax. Then you have reserved. These are powers just for the state. So things like controlling the election, controlling marriage laws, setting requirements for, trying to get this light to be a little brighter, requirements for professionals. So for example, as a teacher, I'm certified to teach in New York State, but I had to comply with New York State laws to be able to become certified. We have the Bill of Rights also. I've already mentioned it's the first 10 amendments. Some of the big ones to remember is the First Amendment, which is the freedom of religion, press, and speech. The Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments are protections for people. And then 10th Amendment says that any power not given to the federal government is reserved to the states. The unwritten Constitution, just think about it this way. These are policies, procedures, practices that are not written in the Constitution. That's why they're called unwritten Constitution. So the terms presidency, originally part of the unwritten Constitution until we make an amendment. A presidential cabinet, so those are their advisors. Advisors are not in the Constitution, but this is something that has been instituted. You also have political parties. Political parties have developed. They were not written into the Constitution. Congressional committees, and then, of course, judicial review. These are all elements of our government that were not part of the Constitution, but are part of practice now. As far as the Constitution goes, this is still our structure for government. This is the supreme law of the land, and it replaced the Articles of Confederation to make a stronger federal government. Many see the federal government as expanded in power over the years, but it really needed to be developed to address all these weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So now, you know, the federal government can coin their own money. States can't have their own money. They can collect taxes. They can maintain a military. All these things that they really needed that they were unable to do under the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitution will really address those weaknesses of the Articles and make sure that our federal government can function and take care of what needs to be taken care of. Okay. I'm just going through, making sure I'm not missing anything else. Making sure no one's sending me any messages or chats. Okay. So one of the other topics that I was asked to cover was the Industrial Revolution, which then included the Gilded Age and reform movements. So, a lot of this you might remember from last year when you took global, but the Industrial Revolution in America will have a lot of comparisons to that in Great Britain. So what we see is as industry takes hold, it kind of just snowballs. The more industrial we get, the more industrial we need to get, and it just completely continues to expand. So in America, in the early 1800s, we still see that the United States has this policy of laissez-faire, or as Ms. Hardy says, this lazy government, right? They don't get involved. They let businesses just do their thing. This was good for the American economy. Development of monopolies and trust, where you have these big businesses that control all elements of production for their industry, and they're able to get rid of competition, and they're able to push out the little man and take complete control, which is good for business because these businesses are now able to make a lot of money. And then we see, this issue where owners of these businesses are extremely wealthy while workers are extremely poor. And then that just opens the floodgates to other issues. So this is a time period where people start to question, are monopolies good? Are trusts good? Should the government continue to not do anything, or should they end the policy of laissez-faire and start to regulate business? People start to argue we need to regulate business. We need competition. Competition between businesses are good for consumers, and it helps protect workers as well. So we need to make sure that monopolies and trusts are broken up. So this idea that laissez-faire needs to come to an end really comes out of this Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age kind of refers to America during this age of industrialization and big business, where you have all these millionaires emerging, and people are looking out in are like, man, American economy is doing really good. They have millionaires. I mean, it's great. And on the inside, though, there's a lot of societal issues. There's a lot of poverty. I will get there. I will get there, Spencer. I will do imperialism. There's a lot of poverty. There's low wages, long hours, unsafe working conditions, and there's a lot of problems. So it looks great on the outside, but when you look deeper, there's issues. And then the Gilded Age will give way to the progressive era, where reformers are trying to progress society or make society better. So they start to debate, are these industrial leaders like Rockefeller and Carnegie and JP Morgan robber barons, and they use unfair labor practices and business practices to make money, or are they captains of industry and they're just capitalizing on what's available to them to make money? And people are like, no, you know what? Trusts are bad, monopolies are bad. Government needs to deal with this. They need to legislate, and they need to start to address these business problems so that we can start to address societal issues. So we see now during the progressive movement, there's a push for the government to interfere. People are like, look, trust can be bad. Theodore Roosevelt starts to go after trust as president. He starts to try to break up monopolies with the Sherman Antitrust Act, trying to make it illegal to form a trust or monopoly. We also see that the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 will try to prevent special rates or rebates for customers on railroads. These railroad companies were making deals with big businessmen, kind of giving them kickbacks, like, no, we can't do this. So we start to see the government stop their laissez-faire policies and start to really get involved. Now that we're dealing with big businesses, we're going after trusts and monopolies to try to break those up so that we have more competition. We can also address problems that came along with this. As people flocked into these industrial centers to try to find work, we see urbanization. So cities are growing and expanding, but with that, we have a lot of poverty, there's overpopulation, there's unsanitary conditions, there's disease being spread. And then we also see that we get a lot of corruption in governments, because there's a lot of money that can be thrown around by big businessmen, and that needs to be addressed as well. So as we start to look at big businesses, we also start to look elsewhere, and this is really thanks to muckrakers. These are investigative journalists. They're writing books. So, like Ida Tarbell writes the history of the Standard Oil Company. She exposes Rockefeller's abuses in business, and that helps the government become involved in trying to regulate businesses. The other big one, Upton Sinclair, writes The Jungle about the meatpacking industry in Chicago and how disgusting it is. And now we see that there's going to be reforms for meat packing and food packing. Theodore Roosevelt's going to support the Meat Inspection Acts, make sure we know the meat's healthy, the Pure Food and Drug Act. We know it's in our food today because of this law. Then we also see Lincoln Steffens writes The Shame of the Cities, which talks about all these political machines, these corrupt political groups. And we're going to see that democratic reforms are going to be passed to try to help end these political machines. So I'm going to start first by talking about increasing democracy and going after these political machines. So shame of the cities, lots of corruption. The other big one, if you watched Gangs in New York, or if you watched the documentary on William Boss Tweed, he ran Tammany Hall in New York City, stole millions of dollars from New York City taxpayers. And you see this in a lot of cities where you'd have a person or a group of people that would have all the political power and use that to keep getting elected and to get favors and to essentially rob their constituents. So we get the direct primary during the Progressive Era, which allows voters to select candidates for political office. This gives people more power in their political party. Recall. People have more political power because now it's going to be easier to remove elected officials from office. Not happy with them, they're not doing their job, they're corrupt, hold a recall. A referendum allows voters to decide if legislation or laws should be passed by voting on them. If people don't agree with the laws, they can vote against them and they get shut down. And then the initiative allows people to initiate or propose laws. So all of these increase democracy in the United States. As far as poverty goes, we're going to see that the federal government will address wage issues. They'll address safety and working conditions. You'll see issues. The big one that you guys always remember is like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City, where you have this fire at a factory and a lot of young girls die, and people see that and they're just upset about it. It's distraught. They're distraught and they're like, how could this have happened? Why are there not any rules or regulations to protect our workers? And then we'll see now there's going to be safety regulations. There's going to be building code regulations. Child labor will be addressed, and regulations are going to be put into place to limit how many hours children can work and at what age they could be hired. All of this is going to take place during the Progressive Era. We also see during the Progressive Era, women start to fight once again a little louder for the right to vote. And the 19th Amendment will be passed that allows women the right to vote. You also see the women Christians temperance movement push for prohibition, because while we see all these societal issues, you have this group of people who are like, a lot of these issues are because of alcohol. Men go to the bars, they drink, they spend all their money, then they go home and, they're upset that, they spent all their money and they're broke and they're drunk, and then they beat their wives, they beat their children, and this creates abuse and then more poverty. And these prohibitionists, people who are trying to get prohibition passed, this, ban on the sale and trade of alcohol, are able to get an amendment passed to ban alcohol. This is the 18th Amendment. Now remember this, because if you're 18, you're not old enough to drink. So the 18th Amendment makes it illegal to sell alcohol. But then I also point out that, this is the 1920s. This is that, era of the Great Gatsby. So if you've seen the movie or you read the book, people are still partying. You have bootleggers. People are sneaking in illegal alcohol. There's speakeasies. So it gives this rise, this whole organized crime element. And within a decade or so, the government realizes that, hey, you know what, this probably wasn't a great idea. And then they passed the 21st Amendment to eliminate prohibition. And you can remember that because when you're 21, you're old enough to drink. So 18th Amendment bans alcohol, 21st ends prohibition. But those are some of the reforms. We also see, I'm just trying to think about not, um, there's also going to be movements to help aid immigrants and poor individuals living in these urban areas, such as like the whole houses. But during this whole time, the one group of people who are still kind of getting the shaft are farmers. Even though there's a lot of change happening, the government's and laissez-faire, and they're really going after businesses and trying to help the people, farmers are still living in extreme poverty. They're still really struggling in many parts of the country. Okay, let's see. Okay, so treaties. Some people had asked me about treaties, so I'm going to go through some treaties. So these are like agreements that have been made to either end wars or other kinds of agreements between the United States and another entity, another country. So I'm just going to focus on the big ones that you're probably going to see. And if it just applies for HOA, I'll just say, hey, this is for HOA. And if you're just in the US regions, you can ignore it. So there's a bunch of Treaty of Paris treaties. So the first one is 1763 that ends the French and Indian War between England and France. And you can remember that because following this, the proclamation of 1763 is passed. And that's going to essentially tell the British colonists they cannot pass the Appalachian Mountains because the British are trying to avoid future conflicts with Native Americans. The next Treaty of Paris will end the American Revolution with Great Britain, and that's going to negotiate the new boundary of the United States of America to the Mississippi River. Jay's Treaty will be negotiated by Jay at the bequest of George Washington. And as part of this treaty, Great Britain's going to agree to leave the forts that they had still occupied in the United States, even though they were supposed to have left after the American Revolution. The next one, the Louisiana Purchase. This was a treaty. I think there's some confusion, but the only way that this land could have been purchased legally was through an amendment, and Jefferson didn't have the time for an amendment, but he did have the power to negotiate treaties. So he was like, if I use my power to negotiate a treaty, then I can have purchasing the land from France as part of that treaty. And that is how Jefferson was able to kind of get around this issue, because the Constitution had never really addressed purchasing land from a foreign nation. So he uses this loose interpretation, which he had originally been strictly against, but he's like, it's a great deal. I can double the size of America for $15 million. Why would I not do that? The Treaty of Ghent is the treaty that ends the War of 1812 with England and the United States. I mean, no one gains any land or anything, but, we do show, hey, we can fight the British again. HOA, you might want to know the Adams-Onis Treaty, which is where Spain gives Florida to the United States. For both groups, the Oregon Treaty basically is just divides the Oregon country between the United States and Canada. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the war with Mexico, and that leads to the United States acquiring a bunch of land from Mexico, including parts of California and New Mexico, etc. Then we get another Treaty of Paris, which will end the Spanish-American War, which, of course, the United States is going to emerge as an imperialistic power. So this is something that's really just for HOA, since HOA got to imperialism and the Regents class did not. So for HOA, Treaty of Paris ends the Spanish-American War. The United States emerges as imperialistic nation. Cuba gets their independence, but the U.S. acquires Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Platt Amendment, HOA might see, this makes Cuba a U.S. protectorate. And then HOA, also the Treaty of Versailles, will end World War I. Germany is going to be forced to pay reparations. They're going to have to accept war guilt. The League of Nations will be created, but the U.S. refuses to sign this, and they refuse to join the League of Nations, which makes them really weak. So those last couple ones were just for HOA. Okay, so if you are listening, I think I'm going to do, I had a request for Andrew Jackson stuff. So I'm going to go over Jackson, and then I'm going to talk about imperialism, which will just be for HOA. So Andrew Jackson, so he is an interesting guy. I once had a student write me a 6-page paper as to why I should like and appreciate Andrew Jackson for fun. So Andrew Jackson was, common man. And a lot of times they referred to him as this, the common man, old hickory. He was a man's man. He was a war hero from the War of 1812. He had an interesting background. But what he's really known for was kind of, he wasn't really, from a wealthy, educated, gentry family. Like most politicians we had were, people from these wealthy backgrounds and were highly educated. Maybe they were lawyers or career politicians. But here's this guy who just kind of worked his way up and was just, typical man. And he's going to try to expand democracy under his tenure as president. So, he really pushes for allowing all men to vote, white males anyways, without a property requirement. He pushes for the spoils system. He really believes that, to the victor goes the spoils. Now that he's president, he should be able to appoint his supporters to government jobs. His argument was that he was given opportunities to people who otherwise wouldn't have had them. He also was a huge supporter of Indian removal. The Supreme Court ruled on Worcester versus Georgia, supporting the Cherokee against the state of Georgia. And Jackson was like, they made their decision. Now let them enforce it. He was not going to enforce the ruling because he supported Georgia and he supported the idea of removing Native Americans from their land. So when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, he didn't hesitate to sign it into law. And then this, of course, would spur the Trail of Tears and lead to thousands of Native Americans being pushed off their land into reservations, and then ultimately what many would look at as like a cultural genocide to continue, because as Native Americans are pushed west, white settlers move further west, and then there's just this continuation of removing Native Americans and putting them into reservations or in other areas. And then, of course, this will lead to later on forced assimilation of Native Americans through like the Dawes Act, or taking children away and sending them to boarding schools to teach them, how to be more American. Jackson also hated the Bank of the United States. He absolutely hated the National Bank. And so when it came time, he allowed the bank to expire. And then he took that money and put it into these state banks called pet banks, which had a negative impact on the economy, by shifting that money around. So as far as Andrew Jackson, if you can remember, Indian removal and spoil systems for like the regions, those are the two big ones. But then, the thirdly, if you can remember, he hated the National Bank. That's a good one to remember as well. But otherwise, I think that's it for the regions topics. So I did have a question on imperialism. So I'm going to get into imperialism. Let me just pull up some of my notes so I don't forget anything as I ramble. So this is just going to be a topic for HOA. Imperialism will come later for my U.S. history students. So if you guys want to tune out, you can. And I will get into imperialism. Okay. Okay. So why has America become imperialistic? It seems crazy that we would have fought for independence from an imperialistic nation, but then we go out and we imperialize and conquer other nations in the late 1800s, but we do. And so some of those motives are Um, Similar to reasons why European nations become imperialistic. We need raw materials and markets. Um, there's also a book written by Alfred Thayer Mahan who's about sea power, talking about how sea power is vital to the nation's power as a whole. We need a large navy. And of course, if you need a large navy, you're going to need ports, bases throughout the world that you can refuel and get supplies. We're also now starting to compete with European powers and trying to make a name for ourselves. And of course, this idea of spreading our civilization and Christianity, similar to the white man's burden that we saw with Europeans. So this is going to get really kind of started out with the Spanish-American War. We go to war with Spain. We're trying to help Cuba with their revolution against Spain. There's humanitarian concerns because you have, Cubans being extremely mistreated by the Spanish, put into concentration camps, and this needs to be addressed. We also have a lot of U.S. businesses in Cuba that have invested money. There's yellow journalism because you have a number of newspaper owners who are willing to use stories and headlines to try to sway public opinion. Like the USS Maine, which is a battleship sunk in Havana, and the newspapers just pick this up and they run with it, and they're like, remember the Maine, and this is going to lead to a lot of people really supporting the war and be like, yeah, we need to go to war with Spain. You also see like jingoism, like, this extreme patriotism and the support for war is going to pick up because of yellow journalism and this push for war with Spain. We have finally a victory against Spain. Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders are going to be victorious. We have victory in Cuba, and ultimately the United States will defeat Spain. And with the treaty, we're going to get a number of our early colonies or territories. So Spain will lose Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. The United States gains all those. Cuba is given their independence, but it is going to be a protectorate of ours for a while. So the U.S. is basically gaining those former Spanish possessions. And to this day, we still have Puerto Rico and Guam. And we use these as military bases for a long time. Of course, there's, a lot of people that are against this. We now have our own colonies, and they're like, it's anti-democratic. How are we going to control these other nations and people? How are we going to impose imperialism on them? The United States was a victim of imperialism early on. They were a colony of Great Britain until they fought their own revolution. How can we do this? But ultimately, what we see is that the U.S. emerges. They become a major world power. We start to push new foreign policies. So like in China, we start to push the open door policy. We get involved with trying to crush the Boxer Rebellion to make sure that the U.S. can keep an interest in China. We also see in Latin America, Theodore Roosevelt is going to add the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to be a police power. We're going to speak softly but carry a big stick. We are going to be involved and we are going to intervene. Roosevelt also will use his influence to help Panama gain independence from Colombia so that we can gain the Panama Canal, which is going to be important for our military fleet, but also for our merchant ships. We'll expand into the Pacific, throughout the Caribbean, and essentially we become imperialistic. Excuse me. We are going to gain Alaska. We purchase Alaska from Russia, pushing Russia out of the Northern Hemisphere, increasing more of our power. We also see that after we gain Puerto Rico and etc., we will start to look elsewhere, including Hawaii. This up here. So initially we have missionaries in Hawaii, and then we have businesses in Hawaii, and there's a lot of money to be made there. And after some time, we see that U.S. businesses in Hawaii start to, try to lobby the government, like, you should annex Hawaii, you should take Hawaii and make it part of the United States. And for a while, we were like, no, not going to do that. That's messed up. They have their own monarchy. But ultimately, we realized that this is an important location for ships crossing into the Pacific Ocean. We can spread Christianity there, we can spread American culture, and they're going to be a vital location for trade. So Hawaii ultimately will be annexed, and then in 1959 made a state. Those of you in HOA, I would look at our imperialism case studies for more complete details on each of those. I'm just kind of doing like general overview of American imperialism. I would definitely make sure that you know and understand, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I would make sure you know this whole idea of like the big stick policy: speak softly but carry a big stick. Roosevelt wasn't afraid to use his power and to enforce, American policies or protect our interests. Any other requests? Sending messages out now to some students to see if they have any requests for me. Checking the Twitter feed as well. There is a group chat, but I don't see anyone in here. Okay, let's see. So critical period, that's Articles of Confederation. I did that earlier. Okay. Otherwise, I think that's answering all the questions I have. But what I can do is I'm going to do a screen share real quick, and hopefully this doesn't get messed up. But I can show you some information that you can utilize. So this is, again, for my HOA students. I'm going to go to Google Classroom, and then I'm going to show you through a screen grab some of the things that you can do. So just grab my entire screen. Let's see. Share. And then it's going to get really weird because then you can see everything. So in IB HOA, my students, I would do topics, midterm. This is everything. So the timeline we've been going over in class, I have all like the key answers here, the not details, just the topics. So I would look through that. And then tomorrow, if you have questions, you can ask me. I've posted a bunch of our class notes and study guides from imperialism to World War I, including the imperialism case study I told you to reference if you want more details about the different case studies in imperialism. Then I also did Civil War through Progressive Era. So again, some reviews, some PowerPoints that we've used in class, some notes that I've used as well. And then this is early colonial America resources. So colonists, the American Revolution, the Constitution, Articles of Confederation, early presidents, all that into westward expansion. I've also shared the historiography flashcards that I found on Quizlet. So I would check those out. And you can scroll through and watch those early videos. If there's anything else that you need, you can message me, and I can try to get that going. And then I'm going to go back to my face, hopefully. Oh, stop screen sharing. Okay. Oh no. Yay, I'm back. So hopefully that's everything you need. I'm gonna be tuning out because I've been doing this for about 50 minutes now and I'm tired. But I'll be doing another one on Monday. So you'll have time to get me more topics for Monday. Bye.